Welcome to Prism Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 16 of ASP.NET MVC tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss the difference between update model and try update model function. Please watch part 15 before proceeding with this video. Let's flip to Visual Studio. This is the code that we have been working with in part 15. Let's make a simple change to this create post controller action method with an employee controller. Now, I want to move this condition from there to here. And let's format this code properly, and to do that, select the code and press Ctrl K T. So what are we doing here? So after we invoke this update model function, we are checking the model state. Okay, let's quickly run this with this change, and let's navigate to employee create controller action method. Okay, now let's not fill any data and then press this create button, and let's see what's going to happen. Now look at the change that we made. We are creating a new employee object, and then we are invoking this update model method, which is going to update that model object for us with the data that we are posting here. Now look at this, we are not filling any data here. Okay, so when I click this button, look at what's going to happen. Now we get an error. It says the model of type business layer.employee could not be updated, and that is because if you look at the employee class, look at this, to the employee object we are binding the data. So if you look at the employee class here, this date of birth is of type date time, and date time, if I right click on that and go to definition, look at this, date time is actually a structure, meaning it's a value type, and it's a non-nullable value type. Okay, and then when we submit the form without filling any data, date of birth will be null. Okay, and this property of the employee object, date of birth, is non-nullable property. Okay, meaning we cannot assign a null value, so that's the reason why it's crashing. So let's make it nullable date time data type just by adding a question mark. We discussed about nullable data types in C# video tutorial. Okay, so with this change, let's go ahead and run this application once again, and let's navigate to employee controller create action method, and again, without filling any data, let me go ahead and click on this create button. Look at this, we get a different error now. It says procedure function sp add employee expects a parameter at name which was not supplied. Now if you remember, we have a stored procedure, so sp underscore help text, and the name of the stored procedure is sp add employee. So this is the stored procedure that gets called, and then it's complaining that the stored procedure has got a parameter at name, and for that parameter we are not supplying a value. Okay, why is that? Because if you look at the parameters of the stored procedure here, all of them are required parameters. Okay, since we are passing, look at this, if I don't fill any data and then submit this form, we are passing a value of null, and that's why the stored procedure is complaining that I don't have a value for that parameter. Okay, to make these parameters optional, all I'm doing here is setting them to null. Let's do that for all of the parameters, name, gender, city, and date of birth. And then let's alter this stored procedure. Press F5, so command completed successfully. Now let's go ahead and run this once again. Let's navigate to employee controller create action method, and then let's submit the form without filling any data again. Now look at this, I get another error. Object cannot be cached from db null to other types. And look at where I'm getting the error. We have the error in employee business layer.cs file at line number 34. So let's see what we have at line number 34 in employee business layer.cs file. So if I press Ctrl G and then go to line 34, look at this, this is the line, and look at this, when does this property get executed? When we try to load the employees from TBL employee table. Because what actually happened is, let me actually select the data from the table, and look at that, we have a new row inserted into this table, and look at name, gender, city, date of birth, all of them are null. So when we actually submitted this form, the insert has actually happened, but it inserted a blank row. Why? Because we didn't fill any of the data here. But then after we perform the insert, what is this controller action method doing? It's redirecting the user back to the index action. And what does index action do? Index action is actually retrieving all the employees from the database table and then trying to display them in this index view. But then when we try to retrieve employees, look at what we are doing. We are executing this sp get all employees stored procedure, which is going to retrieve all of the employees, and then we are looping through each row and then converting, assigning name to name, gender to gender, city to city. And look at this, we are assigning date of birth to date of birth, but we need to convert that to date time. Why is that? Because when you use the string indexer to retrieve date of birth out of this reader object, you're converting, by default it's object type, but we need to cast that to date time before we assign it to this date of birth property. Okay, so when we are doing this conversion, this date of birth is actually null, and we are using convert.toDateTime function, so you cannot convert a null object to date time, so that throws an exception. Okay, so how do we correct this error? It's very easy to fix this error. So obviously, what does the error say? Let me click on create once again. Look at that, again the same error, but we should have another blank row inserted into the database table. Look at that. Now, and what does the error say? It says object cannot be cast from db null to other type. So here, this is returning db null. So all we need to do check, before we execute this line, if it's db null. If it's not db null, then go ahead and convert that, otherwise don't do that. And to do that, I'm going to copy this. If RDR of date of birth is db null, and for that entire expression I'm going to use a not condition. So if it's not db null, only then go ahead and try to do the conversion. Okay, with this change, let's go ahead and run this. Let's navigate to create action. Let's click on this button. Look at that, I have the third blank row is inserted, and then we have this blank name, gender, city, date of birth. Now let's say I want name, gender, city, and date of birth, all of these properties of the employee object to be mandatory, because I don't want nulls for any of them to be stored in the database. So how do we do that? It's very easy to do. All you need to do is decorate the properties of this employee model object. This is what we are using as the model object in MVC. So I want name, gender, city, and date of birth to be required fields. If that is the case, all you need to do is decorate these properties with required attribute. We'll discuss more about model data annotations and these attributes in a later video session in detail, but for now understand that to make a particular field as required, all we need to do is decorate that with required attribute. And this required attribute is present in system.entityFramework entity framework assembly. So we need to add a reference to entity framework assembly within this business layer project. Now we already have a reference to entity framework assembly in our MVC web application, but not in the business layer project. So we need to add a reference to that, and to do that we can make use of the NuGet package manager. So go to tools and then select library package manager, manage NuGet packages for solution, and within that check for whatever packages that are installed on this for this solution. So it's still retrieving that information. So we have entity framework, which is already installed. So let's go to installed packages, which should say entity framework is already installed. But then look at this, I have this option here, manage. So let me click on that button, and at the moment a reference to entity framework is only added to MVC demo, which is our MVC web application, but not business layer. So I'm going to select that project and then click on OK. So that should add a reference to entity framework from our business layer project as well. Alright, so that should be done now. So click on close. So we have entity framework there. Now this required attribute class is actually present in a different namespace. So let's go ahead and import that. System.componentModel dot data annotations, and then let's say I want to make name a required field, so I'm just using a required attribute there. Along the same lines, I want to make gender also required, city required, and date of birth required. Okay, so with this change, let's go ahead and run this and see what's going to happen. So at the moment in the database table view, we have 3 blank rows. And let's navigate to employee controller create action. Let's click on this button. Look at that, the model of type business layer.employee could not be updated. And notice where we are getting the exception. We are getting the exception when this method is invoked, update model. Okay, now remember, we have made name, gender, city, and date of birth fields of this employee object mandatory by decorating that with required attribute. So obviously when this update model is called, it inspected the incoming values from the request, and obviously they are null, and update model throws an exception when there are model validation errors. Now instead of using update model, let's go ahead and use try update model and see what's going to happen. So all I'm going to do here is, instead of using update model, I'm going to use try update model, and let's run this now and see what's the behavior. So now I want to navigate to employee controller create action method, click on create button. Notice that I get the messages here. The name field is required, the gender field is required, city is required, date of birth is required. Okay, so now I don't get an exception. So that's the primary difference between update model and try update model. So update model throws an exception if validation fails, whereas try update model will never throw an exception. And another thing to understand here, look at this. This try update model actually returns a boolean, meaning true or false. If it is successful in updating the model, it returns true. If it is unsuccessful, it will return false. When it tries to update the model, and if there are any validation errors, this isValid property of this model state object is going to return false as well. So in which case, if it returns false, we know that this piece of code will not be executed. And look at what we are doing. We are executing this line gets executed, return view. So the end user stays on the same page, and then he has the opportunity to correct these validation errors and then resubmit the form. Okay, so now for example, if I enter some data there, let's say A, male, city, L, and date of birth, let's say for example that one, and click on create. Look at that, the row is inserted as expected. Okay, now, so that's the difference between update model and try update model. The similarity is both of these functions are used to update the model with the form values and perform the validations. Okay, now is it mandatory to use update model or try update model function to update the model? No, the answer is obviously no, because in the previous sessions we have seen how to achieve the same behavior. Now I can simply pass an employee object here. Instead of creating my employee object and then using my using this try update model or update model functions, I can simply pass employee object as a parameter to this controller action method. And look at this, I'm checking model state.isValid. So obviously this object is going to receive the posted form data, and then if there are any validation errors, this model state isValid property of this model state will return false, and then the user stays on the same page and the user get to see the validation failures. Let's go ahead and run this and see if it's going to work as expected. So if I navigate to employee create, I don't fill any data, click on create. Look at that, the behavior is exactly the same, but now we are not using update model or try update model, but still it works the same way. Alright, now so obviously the next question is, so if we can achieve the same thing without using update model or try update model, then why do we need to explicitly invoke model binding by calling these methods? What's the need? What do we achieve by doing so? So if we want to limit on what can be bound, then explicitly invoking model binding can be very useful. Okay, if this is confusing at the moment, don't worry, we'll be talking about this in a later video session in detail. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.